They said his bones were too small for labor. They said his spine bent the wrong way to be of any use. But they still found a price. 8 cents, a sum so low it embarrassed the ledger that recorded it. And yet, some debts outlived the men who paid them. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The record that begins this story is dated September 1851 and filed in the county archives of Pine Hollow, Georgia, once a modest cotton town 30 miles south of Atlanta, now consumed by its sprawl. The document, yellowed and near illegible in places, bears the heading Inventory Adjustment. Harlow Processing Concern, overseen by Samuel T. Harlow, S. It lists, among bolts of muslin, iron fixtures and miscellaneous chattel, a single-line one malformed boy, approximately 12 years of age, purchased from the estate of Mr. C. Timmons for 8 cents. That entry should not have survived. Paper of that grade rarely does, yet somehow, this one endured, pressed between invoices and correspondence, until its rediscovery in the 1940s by a regional historian named E. L. Cray. Cray's marginal note in his typed transcription reads simply, 8 cents. Surely an accounting error, or a cruelty too casual to correct. He was wrong on both counts. In 1851, Samuel Harlow's facility dominated the southern ridge of Pine Hollow. It wasn't a plantation in the strict sense. No stately house, no manicured drive, but rather an industrial farm complex, half warehouse, half workshop. Harlow had built it in the late 1830s, after inheriting both land and debt from his father, a failed merchant. His innovation was to run cotton like a business rather than an inheritance. Every man, woman, and child under his control was treated as an expendable mechanism. The boy, identified only in the surviving payroll fragment as Little Abner, entered that system on August 4, 1851. We know this because Harlow's nephew, a clerk named Jebediah Lark, kept meticulous ledgers, and his handwriting betrays something unusual about the purchase. Next to the boy's name, in tight looping script, he wrote, "Curious specimen, spinal irregularity, reduced height, diminished stature but steady hands, assigned to machinery maintenance." That phrase, "curious specimen," would recur in Harlow's correspondence. Contemporary accounts of Pine Hollow suggest Harlow fancied himself a man of science, though his understanding of the term was crude and self-serving. He subscribed to medical journals from London, collected pamphlets on anatomy, and kept in his study a display case of malformed animal bones, preserved in jars of cloudy spirits. When he purchased Abner for 8 cents, it was not merely to exploit him, but to study him. The first weeks of Abner's life at the facility are absent from official documentation, but oral histories collected decades later mention a little one who worked beneath the belts. The Harlow press, as it was known, ran on steam and muscle, a labyrinth of pulleys, belts, and wooden shafts that churned from dawn to dusk. Witnesses described a narrow crawlspace beneath the cotton press, where only a child could fit to clear jams. By day, Abner moved through those cavities like a shadow, unseen but essential. By night, he slept in the refuse shed with the others deemed unpresentable, for sale or field work, the elderly, the maimed, the sick. It was there, among them, that he began carving small shapes from discarded wood shavings, tiny figures with bent backs like his own. When one of Harlow's overseers discovered the carvings, they were confiscated and burned as evidence of oidliness. The next morning, Harlow himself ordered that Abner wear a slate around his neck on which the word useless was scrawled in chalk. This detail survives in 2 independent testimonies, one from an enslaved woman interviewed in 1936, who claimed her grandmother had witnessed the incident, and another from a letter written by Lark to his cousin, dated September 3, 1851, preserved in a family collection. "My uncle grows peculiar in his amusements. He insists the boy carry that mark as instruction to the rest. It makes me ill to see it. The child neither weeps nor protests. I think he has gone somewhere inward, where cruelty cannot reach him." In early September, production increased to meet an urgent export contract. The press operated well past midnight, its gears slick with oil and sweat. The night foreman later claimed he heard a grinding cry, not metal, not man, just before the power drive seized. By morning, the press floor was slick with blood, and Harlow's head overseer, Raymond Doss, was missing 2 fingers. The incident was recorded as mechanical malfunction resulting in injury and loss of yield. Abner's name does not appear, but later testimony, buried in the 1852 coroner's inquest, makes clear that something darker had occurred. A witness named Clara Bell, aged 10 at the time, recalled, "There was shouting, and then silence. When we came in the next morning, Mr. Harlow was lying under the press. His face, gone. Like the machine had eaten it." The official cause of death: accidental entrapment during routine maintenance. But a small annotation in the corner of the report, likely by the coroner himself, reads, "Suspicion of deliberate act by property. Boy unaccounted for. That boy, Abner, was never seen again." The search party followed faint tracks leading from the press house to the banks of the nearby river, where they vanished. Harlow's widow, Eleanor, claimed he had fled and drowned. The overseers agreed, perhaps relieved to have a story that demanded no further explanation. Yet something about the matter refused to settle. Lark's final entry in the ledger, written the day after the inquest, offers a different picture. No trace of the child found, but in the press room, beneath the frame, I discovered a circle of copper coins, 8 in number. Each set edge to edge in dust. The others said it was mockery, but I think it was something else. A message, or a reckoning. That page ends abruptly. The ink smudged as though the writer's hand had trembled. In the decades that followed, the Harlow facility changed ownership twice before being abandoned after the Civil War. When the main structure was finally demolished in 1894, workers uncovered a narrow passage beneath the press floor, a maintenance cavity less than 3 feet high. Inside, they found fragments of slate, the word USLSS, still faintly visible, and a child's carved figure, its head bowed, its hands clutching what might once have been coins. The discovery made no newspaper at the time. It was too small a story, too old, and too uncomfortable. Only a brief note in a county ledger records it: unidentified remains, possibly animal, reinterred in common ground September 17, 1894. For those who knew the legend, it confirmed what had been whispered for generations, that Abner had not drowned, nor vanished, but had exacted his vengeance and left behind his own epitaph. 8 copper coins, payment returned to the man who had once measured his worth. Even now, the story clings to the land. Locals say the soil where the press once stood refuses to grow grass, that tools left overnight in the clearing are found in the morning rusted, as though decades had passed in a single night. In 1935, a Works Progress Administration crew surveyed the site for a possible memorial. One worker, in his report, described hearing a rhythmic clatter from below the ground, like gears turning in darkness. The foreman dismissed it as imagination, but the worker refused to return the next day. His margin note reads simply, "Sounded like breathing." Today, the Harlow grounds are paved over, a logistics depot sitting where the cotton press once stood. Trucks idle where men once turned the wheels of empire. There is no marker, no acknowledgement. Only a small depression in the asphalt, where rainwater collects, forming a shallow pool that some say turns copper, red at dusk. 8 cents worth of memory. 8 cents worth of blood. The first of the secondary documents appears 6 months later in a small, leather-bound notebook recovered from the estate of Jebediah Lark, Harlow's nephew and bookkeeper. Most of its pages concern shipments, inventories, and mechanical notes, until a section marked Private Memoranda. A March 2, 1852. Each night I hear the belts turning though the boilers are cold. I have taken to walking the press, floor by lantern. The smell of oil is gone, replaced by something sweet and mineral, like coin rubbed with blood. There is chalk on the floor, 8 circles joined in a ring. I cannot tell whether I draw them in my sleep or whether another hand continues what mine began. Lark's handwriting deteriorates after this entry, slanting toward the margins. The final page of the notebook contains a rough sketch of the press mechanism, annotated in his careful accountant's script. Near the lowest gear he wrote, "Cavity unmeasured, depth uncertain." 2. The visitation in 1853. The property passed to Eleanor Harlow, the widow, who leased the remaining outbuildings to a cotton broker from Savannah. Her correspondence with a local physician, Dr. Henry Calder, forms the next layer of the record. Calder's tone is polite but increasingly alarmed. Letter from Dr. Calder to Mrs. E. Harlow, April 14, 1853. Madam, regarding the nocturnal disturbances you describe, the hammering beneath the floorboards, the metallic rasp, permit me to observe that the boilers and belts, though motionless, retain considerable tension. It is not uncommon for trapped air or settling timbers to simulate motion. I advise abstaining from further nocturnal vigils. Sleep, and the mind will quiet. A later letter, undated, carries a different tone. You insist the sounds form words. You ask whether metal may remember command. Such fancies lie beyond my art. Eleanor's replies have not survived, but Calder's diary notes that she became devoutly fixed upon the notion of reanimation through pressure. Convinced that the machinery itself sought restitution, by summer 1853 she had relocated to her sister's house in Augusta, leaving the building unoccupied except for Lark, whose letters cease entirely after July. 3. The inspection. For nearly 20 years the Harlow facility stood abandoned, weathering to a gray husk above the river. In 1871, after the war, the county authorized a survey to determine whether the structure could be salvaged for grain storage. The inspector, E.J. Marrow, filed a 3-page report, preserved in the state archives. The main press remains intact though motionless. Within the pit below, the gearing eye observed corrosion in concentric rings, as though heat had issued outward from a single point. Wooden beams show impressions of small hands. When struck with a hammer, the frame produced a tone too pure for rusted iron. Marrow added, almost as an afterthought, one workman, Mr. Crane, descended to measure the cavity and emerged in panic, claiming the air below was breathing. He will not return. No further work was attempted. The county deemed the site structurally unsound and sealed the entrance with stone. 4. The archivist's theory. In 1904, an antiquarian named Elias Marrow, a lecturer in natural philosophy at the New University in Atlanta, rediscovered Lark's notebook at an estate sale. He published a short paper in the Southern Journal of Industrial History, arguing that the Harlow facility represented the earliest example of psychomechanical haunting. His thesis, though now regarded as pseudoscience, is strikingly modern. The rhythmic operations of industry, repeated across years, may impress patterns upon both metal and mind. If human suffering occurs in synchrony with machinery, the energy of one may record itself upon the other. Thus a press may remember a death, a boiler may dream. Marrow requested permission to visit the ruins. The caretaker who guided him, an elderly freedman known only as Mr. Jinks, later told the Atlanta Courier that Marrow descended alone into the sealed chamber and returned pale, clutching something wrapped in cloth. He refused to speak during the journey back, except to mutter, "The circle was not chalk." That night, the caretaker awoke to the sound of the press turning though no engine remained. Marrow was found the next morning sitting upright in his hotel bed, eyes open, mouth filled with copper filings. His article was withdrawn from publication. 5. The modern echo. By the 1930s, Pine Hollow had nearly disappeared, swallowed by industry. A WPA survey team, unaware of the legend, used the ruins as storage for mapping equipment. One member, Harold Dean, kept a daily log later recovered from his personal papers. November 19, 1935, the men swear the ground vibrates after dusk. I felt it myself. A faint pulsing under the boards like a heart beneath cloth. Found an old slate fragment etched with the word Lee SS. The rest broken away. November 27, 1935, dreamed of a child crouched within gears, woke to find 8 coins on my cot, arranged in a ring. None of the others admits to it. Dean's log ends abruptly 4 days later. The final line, penciled in haste. The belts are moving. 6. The county hearing. Records show that after Dean's disappearance, local officials ordered the structure demolished. The minutes of the county hearing, held December 12, 1935, include testimony from a foreman named R.T. Morgan. When we struck the main beam, the timbers screamed. Not the sound of breaking wood, something higher, like a whistle through bone. Then the press fell in upon itself, and the dust rose copper-colored. I swear I saw footprints in that dust, small as a child's, walking away from the wreck. The chair of the committee dismissed Morgan's account as fatigue, yet the transcript ends with a curious directive: all recovered metal to be melted at once. No fragments retained. Even the paperwork describing the melting was later reported missing. 7. The present silence. Today the site lies beneath a concrete shipping yard. The asphalt buckles each spring despite repeated resurfacing. A maintenance worker interviewed in 1998 described the same low hum reported for generations, like a wheel turning very far away. Environmental sensors register no vibration, but every few years a driver reports finding coins fused into the tar near the drainage grate. 8. Always 8. Weathered beyond date. The county archives store them in an unlabeled envelope. Each time the drawer is opened, the smell of heated metal escapes. A faint sweetness, mineral and wrong. In assembling these records, I have found no proof of the boy's existence, nor of his revenge, nor of any supernatural event. What remains undeniable is the pattern: a life reduced to notation, a death reduced to mechanism, a town reduced to forgetting, and perhaps that is horror enough. For every generation that touches the Harlow facility, by coin, by tool, by curiosity, he returns not as ghost, but as memory insisting on weight. 8 cents. 8 circles, 8 turns of the press that no longer exists. There are places where the record itself trembles, where ink seems to recoil from truth. Dr. Alden Vey, Private Memorandum, 1854. The official inquiry into the events at Harlow was convened in late November 1854, less than 6 weeks after the disappearance of Dr. Alden Vey and the abrupt cessation of the facility's operations. The Board of Proprietors at the Georgia Institute for Medical Advancement assembled a small committee in Atlanta to determine whether Harlow's charter should be revoked and its property seized. What survives of those proceedings was preserved in a single folio marked Inquest. Harlow Station, its cover warped by moisture, the inner pages brittle as dried leaves. The first testimony came from Edwin Pratt, a junior steward who had fled the property 2 days after the final storm. Pratt's account, recorded in a cramped, uncertain hand by the committee clerk, begins plainly enough. I found the main corridor deserted. All the instruments left running. The south wing lamps still lit, though none remained to tend them. It was as though the work had been abandoned mid-procedure. He described an atmosphere of silent order, the kind one finds in rooms recently vacated by the living, but not yet reclaimed by decay. The committee asked him about the experiments Dr. Vey had authorized that autumn. Pratt hesitated, then said he had never seen the subjects directly, only heard them. Like wind under the floorboards, he said. Not voices, exactly. Something that wished to become language. The inquiry shifted to Elias Merrin, the assistant physician. His statement was more measured, but no less unsettling. He insisted that Dr. Vey's work had been purely anatomical, a study of deformities among the rural poor, funded by the Institute and sanctioned by local authorities. There was nothing immoral in it. Merrin testified. Only excessive curiosity, yet the longer he spoke, the more contradictions appeared. He claimed the doctor had sealed the lower archives, that he had dismissed the servants and forbade access after sunset, that he had begun referring to certain specimens by Christian names rather than catalog numbers. When asked to specify these specimens, Merrin declined. He merely said, "They were born wrong," but he swore they were instructive. The committee's clerk, perhaps sensing the weakness of Merrin's resolve, pressed further, "And were these specimens human?" A pause follows in the transcript. Then, once, "Yes." The inquest continued for 6 days. Each surviving witness offered a fragment, a corner of a picture no one wished to complete. Servants spoke of rooms kept locked from within. A messenger recalled delivering parcels marked only with the initials MH. No origin listed. An itinerant preacher reported hearing cries near the mill pond after midnight, like the bleating of something that knew itself lost. No physical evidence was presented. The committee's report concludes that Dr. Vey died in an industrial mishap, that the facility's records were destroyed by fire, and that no further investigation was warranted. But among the appendices lies a curious addition, a letter dated October 29, 1854, addressed to the board but never sent, found later among Vey's personal effects. The letter reads in part, "We have reached the boundary between structure and spirit. The child's physiology refutes natural law, yet his mind obeys none of our expectations. He dreams of corridors I have not built, describes faces I have not shown him. I fear the deformity we study is not of bone, but of inheritance, ours, not his. A.V. The child referred to remains unidentified. Some historians speculate he was one of the orphans. Acquired through county relief contracts, a practice by which indigent children were surrendered to institutions in exchange for a small fee. Others argue that the child was metaphorical, a symbol of Vey's intellectual offspring, the experiment itself. Either interpretation casts a long shadow over the matter. When the property at Harlow was auctioned the following spring, nearly all documents were declared lost to water damage. The laboratory wing was demolished, yet certain items persisted: a copper anatomical model, a sheaf of water-stained drawings, and a sealed crate labeled No. 17, retained for study. Its contents were never officially logged. Rumors persisted among local workers that the crate emitted a faint ticking, like a watch buried in salt. The foreman dismissed it as superstition. By June 1855, the crate had vanished from the Institute's storage hall. An inventory note from years later lists its absence with the simple phrase, "Item transferred, destination unknown." Nearly 30 years passed before Harlow was mentioned again in academic circles. In 1883, a paper appeared in the Southern Journal of Medical Ethics authored by Dr. Merrin, now elderly and living in Savannah, titled, "On Certain Hereditary Malformations Observed in the Piedmont Region." The article contained diagrams unmistakably similar to those recovered from Vey's collection. At first glance they seemed ordinary studies of spinal curvature and limb deformity, but several figures depicted features that defied human proportion: elongated digits, rib counts exceeding 24, cranial sutures forming labyrinthine patterns. In a marginal note, likely by a later reader, someone wrote, "Compare to Harlow case, 1854, same hand, same guilt." The following year Merrin was found dead in his study, slumped over his desk, a bottle of laudanum open beside him. The final entry in his notebook read, "The body is a map of its maker's cruelty. We inherit not just flesh, but intention." For decades afterward, Harlow became a ghost story among medical students. They whispered of the Georgia clinic that bred itself into madness, of Vey's attempt to isolate a hereditary strain of obedience. Professors dismissed it as rumor, yet none could account for the missing crate or the disappearance of certain early anatomical specimens catalogued under the same numbering system. Then, in 1902, the Institute's archives were transferred to a new campus. During cataloging, a young assistant named Ruth Fenner discovered a small ledger hidden inside the hollow spine of a discarded anatomy text. Its cover bore only the initials AV. The ledger contained 23 short entries spanning the final weeks before Harlow's closure. Most were notes on temperature, pulse, and reflex response, routine clinical data, but the last two entries depart entirely from scientific tone. Sept 30. The subject hums when I approach, a melody resembling No Hymn I Know. He has taken to arranging his food in patterns, circles within circles. When I asked him why, he said, so I remember the price. Oct 10. He no longer eats. The circles are now of metal, not bread. I do not recall giving him coins. Oct 13. His hands are changing, or mine are. Difficult to say which belongs to whom. No signature follows. The remaining pages are blank. When Fenner presented the ledger to her supervisor, it was confiscated under the pretext of institutional integrity. She resigned soon after, reportedly suffering recurring dreams of a child's face behind glass. The ledger vanished again into the restricted archives, where it remained until a partial microfilm copy surfaced in 1971 among the papers of a local historian. That copy, though fragmentary, reignited interest in the case and led to renewed efforts to locate the physical remains of the Harlow facility. Excavations in 1974 uncovered only foundation stones and fragments of laboratory glassware, but one discovery stood out: a corroded tin circle containing 7 copper coins, fused by time into a single lump. Whether coincidence or deliberate echo, the find revived speculation that Vay's subject might have survived him, or worse, outlived him. The inquest records end abruptly. The final page of the clerk's transcript bears an unfinished sentence. Let the matter rest. Followed by an ink blot, so large it obscures the remaining words. Later historians have tried to interpret that blot as accidental, but chemical analysis shows traces of heat, as if the page had been seared rather than spilled upon. Some claim the stain itself contains faint impressions of letters, burned through successive sheets, forming words only visible under certain light. Those who examined them closely reported a recurring phrase: debt unpaid. Whether that phrase originated with Vay Merrin or one of their subjects remains uncertain, but it appears again in the oral traditions of the surrounding county. Stories of a small figure seen near the ruined mill after storms, leaving circles of tarnished pennies in the mud. If you've followed the story this far, you know by now that every silence in these records hums with what was omitted. And maybe that's the true horror of Harlow, not the violence itself, but the industry of forgetting that followed it. The past leaves its body in architecture. Every beam is a bone. Field Notes, Reconstruction Survey, 1975. The first excavations of the Harlow ruins began in earnest in the spring of 1975, led by a small academic team from Emory University's Department of Historical Medicine. Officially, the dig was meant to document 19th century rural hospital design. Unofficially, the team sought something far stranger, evidence that Dr. Alden Vay's facility had extended below the original foundation. They found it on the 7th day. While clearing debris from what had once been the southern wing, a graduate student's trowel struck metal. Beneath the packed clay, a rusted iron hatch lay flush with the earth. It bore no hinges or handles, only a seam and 4 bolts fused tight with corrosion. The hatch was roughly 4 feet across, circular, and sealed from within. When they finally pried it open with crowbars and a winch, a smell of mineral damp and old formaldehyde rose out like the breath of a sealed tomb. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. The first man down was Dr. Wallace Keir, the project's principal investigator. His notes from that day survive, preserved in the Emory archive. The entry begins: at a depth of 15 feet, air grows cool, metallic. The walls are stone, roughly hewn. No torch soot, implying disuse, or that lamps once burned with a cleaner fuel. At bottom, a corridor, 12 paces long, leading to a chamber. Door locked from the inside, handle rusted to dust. The team forced the door open and found themselves in a low, ceilinged room approximately 12 by 9 feet. The walls were lined with shelving, glass jars, their contents long since liquefied into amber film. In the center stood a wooden table with restraints fixed at both ends, and beneath that table, half buried in silt, the remains of what Keir first took to be a collapsed support frame. It was not a frame, it was a cradle, handmade, iron-banded, sized for a small body. The find was quietly removed to the university laboratory. Official reports described it as a pediatric therapeutic apparatus. But Keir's private journal told another story. This was no bed for treatment. It was containment. The iron at the joints is worn smooth, an object thrashing, not a patient resting. The wood warped inward, not outward. Something within struggled to escape. The discovery made national news for a week, then faded from public interest. But among scholars, whispers multiplied. Keir's team had also recovered fragments of parchment from a collapsed alcove. Though water damaged, several phrases were legible: reflex memory, a subject attempts mimicry, blood viscosity beyond measure. A later chemical analysis identified traces of mercury, copper, and something else, an unclassified residue described in the lab report as organic but unidentifiable. In the months that followed, Keir became increasingly erratic. Colleagues reported that he refused to enter the dig site after dusk. He complained of hearing a rhythmic clicking, like coins clinking together in a bowl. On the night of August 3rd, he was found alone in the lab, staring at the cradle. Around it, 7 pennies lay arranged in a perfect ring. He insisted he hadn't placed them there. His written account from that night is both meticulous and desperate. It is not superstition. The arrangement appears each morning, no matter how I clear it. I've recorded it on film. The coins reappear after the lights are out, always oxidized, always 7, never 8. The pattern corresponds precisely to the dimensions of the iron cradle. I can no longer doubt what Vey sought to replicate, the cost of a life. After that entry, Keir's notes become fragmented, half-scrawled diagrams, lists of names, sketches of vertebrae tapering into spirals. One page is entirely filled with the repeated phrase, "Inheritance demands payment." He was hospitalized later that year following what the official report called a prolonged dissociative episode. He never returned to the site. In 1977, the university quietly sealed the Harlow chamber. Access was restricted, for safety reasons, and the excavation records were archived. But rumors persisted among graduate assistants that lights still flickered in the southern field, that the ground sometimes hummed after rainfall, that the earth there refused to settle. One student, Michael Dern, later claimed to have entered the site at night with a friend. In a taped interview recorded decades later, Dern recounted what they found. It wasn't what you'd call a haunting. It was quieter than that. The air was wrong, like you'd stepped into someone's breath. The cradle was gone, but the imprint was there in the dirt, still warm, and along the walls. Handprints, small ones, perfect, pressed deep like the stone was soft when touched. No corroboration of his claim exists, but in photographs of the site taken years earlier, faint impressions can indeed be seen along the base of the walls, indentations too regular to be natural. Meanwhile, interest in the Harlow archives resurfaced among historians, studying the antebellum South's medical industry. A 1982 symposium at Tulane devoted a full session to ethical lapses in early research facilities. Vey's name appeared on the program as a footnote to Experimental Eugenic Practices, 1830-1855. One presenter, Dr. Lillian Caro, argued that Vey's work anticipated later pseudo-scientific movements that sought to correct deformity through lineage control. She cited his lost manuscript, The Morphological Debt, of which only fragments survived. According to Caro's abstract, Vey believed that human imperfection could be quantified in currency, that deformity represented a balance unpaid to nature, and that through certain interventions, that debt could be transferred or absolved. Her paper ended with an unsettling observations. In Vey's surviving correspondence, the word inheritance appears 71 times. The word mercy appears once, and it is crossed out. Sometime in the early 1990s, a fire destroyed part of the Emory Medical Archive, Many of the Harlow files were assumed lost, yet in 1998, a janitor clearing out a storage closet discovered a sealed envelope behind a cabinet. Inside were 9 photographic slides dated October 1956, 20 years before the official excavation. No record exists of any survey that year. The slides show a man standing in a shallow pit, holding a lantern. His face is obscured by glare. Behind him, a curved iron door identical to the one Keir's team would uncover 2 decades later. On the back of each slide, handwritten in faded inky, South Wing. Access maintained. Maintained. The word implied continuity, that the hatch had never been buried at all, merely hidden. When the photographs were shown to the surviving members of the 1975 dig, none recognized the man. Yet Keir's widow later stated that her husband had once received an anonymous letter containing a single sentence. "You were not the first to open it." Today, the Harlow property lies beneath a thicket of loblolly pine and wild sumac. The ground is uneven, prone to small sinkholes after heavy rain. Locals avoid it. Hunters say their dogs refuse to cross the creek that borders the southern edge. Every few years, metal scavengers unearth scraps from the old foundation. Hinges, nails, fragments of copper tubing. Occasionally they find coins. Always 7, never 8. Always arranged in a circle. The story of Harlow, like so many born of secrecy and science, was meant to be forgotten. Yet each generation rediscovers it in some form. An article, a rumor, a late-night broadcast. The names change, the details shift, but the pattern persists. The man who studied deformity, the child who defied it, the circle of copper marking the price, and through it all, one phrase echoes across centuries: a debt unpaid. To alter the flesh, one must first deceive the memory that made it. Fragment, unsigned 1851. The sealed letters of Dr. Alden Vey were discovered in 2003 during the restoration of the Harlow archives. They had been misfiled, tucked between ledgers from the Georgia Agricultural Board, and wrapped in oilcloth darkened with soot. The envelope bore no name, only the stamp of a defunct postal office near Macon, dated October 17, 1851. Inside were 7 letters written in a neat but increasingly unstable hand. Each was addressed to a single recipient, Professor J. Holcroft of the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, an anatomist with whom Vey had once corresponded on the hereditary transmission of form. Only the first 5 letters were complete. The last 2 were torn mid-sentence, the paper brittle, the ink leached to a faint green. Their contents were never meant for publication. Yet reading them, one can trace the descent of a mind from rigorous empiricism to something else entirely. A fevered belief that the body itself could be rewritten if one could reach deep enough into its ancestral memory. Letter I, February 3, 1851. My dear Holcroft, I have at last procured a specimen suitable for our inquiry. The measurements deviate in all the expected ways, yet cognition is unimpaired. The vocalization is crude but imitation remarkable. The ratios of limb to trunk align precisely with the telic hypothesis you proposed. That form, once interrupted, seeks completion in mimicry. I have begun the nightly trials. The child responds to sequence, rhythm, light. When exposed to alternating illumination, the pupil dilates not in reaction to brightness but to pattern. I suspect memory encoded not in thought but in reflex, ancestral repetition. More soon. A.V. This first letter is clinical, almost proud. The language suggests a living subject, possibly a child born with physical deformities, whom Vey saw not as patient but as specimen. Scholars have long debated whether this figure was the origin of the later folklore surrounding Harlow, a small boy bought or taken, whose proportions were said to defy both growth and decay. Letter 2, March 9, 1851. Holcroft, the trials advance. I have induced replication of gesture through mirrored exposure. He watches my hand. Within a moment, he reproduces it. Though the fingers twist beyond their natural joint, there is pain, yes, but brief, followed by laughter. Mine or his, I cannot tell. The flesh learns faster than language. I believe I stand at the edge of revelation. What we inherit is not just structure but expectation. The body anticipates itself, even when it should not, and when denied, it dreams. Tonight I will attempt transfusion. If the premise holds, memory may yet be transferable through the smallest vessel of blood. Pray for clarity, though I suspect it will not come. Attached to this letter were 2 pages of diagrams later catalogued as unspecified vascular schema. The notes referred to an exchange ratio of 8:1, a figure repeated in later writings. It is unclear whether this referred to volume, dilution, or symbolic economy, an unsettling echo of value and worth. Letter Etheru, April 18, 1851 Holcroft, I Arid. The transfusion did not yield expected results. Instead, the subject's pulse vanished for 13 minutes, then resumed, slower, steadier. Upon revival, he recited a verse I do not recall ever teaching him. It was in a tongue I cannot identify, yet the rhythm, oh, the rhythm, matched the pump of the press in the cotton mill. You remember the one behind the infirmary? That steady cadence that folds matter into itself. I dream of it now, each night, like breath made of iron. He dreams it too. He smiles when it begins. I will not sleep tonight. Here, the letters grow feverish. Vey begins conflating the language of medicine with that of machinery. Scholars note how this mirrors the broader industrial anxieties of the time. The transformation of organic life into mechanism, the body into commodity. Yet there is something more personal, almost confessional in these passages. It is as though he has begun to envy the child's strange resilience. Letter IV, June 2, 1851 Holcroft. There has been a manifestation. The new growth is not pathological but intentional. Beneath the skin, small nodes, cartilaginous, deliberate, forming a spiral at the base of the spine. I believe the flesh remembers its earlier drafts, as if sketching what it once was meant to be. When I press my hand to it, there is warmth, and beneath the warmth, a ticking. I recorded the rhythm 7 intervals, pause, 8 beats, pause. I recognize it now as measure. The press again, the machine. The child is the instrument, and I, fool that I am, have tuned him. You wrote once that we pursue knowledge at the cost of mercy. Perhaps I have spent both. This letter was the last fully signed by Vey. His signature appears faint, as though written with a shaking hand. The growth he describes has been interpreted by some as an infection, by others as psychosomatic projection. Yet the rhythmic pattern he noted, 7, pause, 8, recurs throughout the Harlow archives, sometimes in marginalia, sometimes carved into walls or wood panels from the property itself. Letter V, July 10, 1851 Holcroft, forgive my silence. The subject has disappeared. I locked the chamber myself, yet the door was open this morning. The air carries that scent again, iron and wet dust. The lamp blackened overnight. There are prints along the floor, small as a child's but too deep to be made by one. I will write no more of experiments. I will instead confess the debt is mine. You understand, don't you? I paid 8 cents, and it was not enough. If you hear the rhythm, 7 and 8, cover your ears. It is not counting, it is remembering. Alden Vey. After this final letter, the correspondence ceases. Vey vanished from public record by the autumn of that year. The Harlow facility was officially shuttered in December, its equipment sold at auction to a textile manufacturer in Augusta. The building fell into decay by 1860. The last mention appearing in a brief newspaper clipping about a small fire in an abandoned medical house. Modern analysts, who have handled the original letters, report peculiar effects. Faint warmth at the paper's center, a metallic odor that resists cleaning. Infrared scans conducted in 2005 revealed undertext beneath the final letter, words written in a different ink, invisible to the eye. The form persists. It mimics light. Do not strike the press. To this day, scholars dispute whether the letters are authentic or fabricated by later archivists, seeking to sensationalize the story, yet even skeptics concede that their physical provenance, ink composition, paper weave, postal marks, places them squarely in 1851. And the handwriting matches, that of V's verified notes from the Harlow clinic. More haunting, however, is what followed their rediscovery. Within weeks of the 2003 restoration, the Emory Preservation Lab reported electrical surges each night near the cabinet where the letters were stored. The data logger recorded rhythmic fluctuations in power, 7 intervals, then 8, recurring precisely every hour. The phenomenon ceased only when the letters were relocated to an off-site vault. An internal memo from that period concludes with a sentence written not by any known staff member, but appended in graphite, unsigned: "The debt remains." Thus, the correspondence bridges centuries, the scientist's ambition collapsing into folklore, his letters into relics of a story that refuses to close. Each attempt to catalog them ends with the same sensation, described by Keir a century later: the faint ticking behind the walls, the suggestion that flesh, once taught to remember, never forgets its teacher. The next part of this investigation takes us deeper into the ledger of those who followed V, who claimed to continue his research under new names and new institutions. Their records survive. Their methods, too. The ledger was discovered entirely by accident in 1903, during the dismantling of the Harlow property, after its sale to the county. The workers were clearing the western cellar, an area that had long been walled off and considered unstable, when one of the mason's picks struck through a patch of thin brick. Behind it lay a narrow cavity, no more than a yard deep, containing a rusted trunk and what appeared to be a child's shoe. The trunk, sealed by corrosion and thick rope, was pried open on sight. Inside, beneath layers of mildewed canvas and ruined correspondence, lay an accounting book bound in calfskin. The spine bore a single inscription, inked in an older hand: Succession. When County Archivist Dr. Alaric Pennington later examined the find, he noted that the handwriting inside the ledger shifted multiple times, suggesting a succession of keepers, rather than a single diarist. Each entry followed a similar formula: date, observation, and notation of experiment or result. But the tone evolved from matter of fact to almost devotional, as though those writing had ceased to record data and begun instead to confess. The earliest dated entry was March 2, 1853, only 2 years after the death of Abel Harlow. The handwriting, matched to surviving documents, belonged to Dr. Erasmus Fenn, the physician hired to manage the remaining household. Condition of the retained subjects appears stable. The last viable sample, taken on the 14th inst, shows no sign of putrefaction despite the lapse of time. I am inclined to attribute this to the mineral composition of the subcellar air. Continuing observation recommended. No indication is given as to what subjects referred to, though later entries clarify that Fenn had been overseeing the study of certain preserved biological materials kept beneath the house. By June of that same year, the tone darkens, audible movements in the night hours. I have dismissed the servants twice for fear they may hear. It is not the rats. I know the difference. The floor itself seems to exhale. Pennington, in his 1904 report to the State Historical Committee, described these notes as the earliest surviving record of what the local population would later call the Harlow resonance, a phenomenon variously reported as sound, tremor, or luminous exhalation, depending on the witness. The ledger's second hand appears around 1858, after Fenn's abrupt disappearance from public record. The new entries, penned in a smaller, steadier script, are signed only with the initials LVs, almost certainly Lemuel Vade. They reveal the continuation of the anatomical experiments Fenn began, but with a colder purpose. The inheritance is confirmed. The deformity transmits cleanly through 3 generations. Note particularly the narrowing of the rib cage, and the partial fusion of vertebrae in the specimens, labeled Harlow, Junder and Ames. The defect is not spontaneous, it is chosen, maintained, cultivated. Perhaps the family believed it sanctified them. If the rumors are true, that the elder Abel harvested blood for infusion, then these remains may represent his failure, not his success. The implication, chilling though indirect, is that the Harlows may have engaged in medical manipulation of their own lineage. The notes suggest that Fenn and Vey were less researchers than custodians of something inherited, something neither dared destroy. In 1864, the handwriting changes again. These later pages are spattered with candle soot and contain long gaps of silence, as though the author feared to continue. The war has drawn away most of the men. The cellar remains undisturbed. At night I hear the faint breathing through the vent. It answers when I speak. If this is delusion, it is persistent. If it is consciousness, it is enduring beyond the flesh. The air tastes of iron, and when I descend, my shadow bends the wrong way on the stone floor. The final entry under LV's hand is dated October 3, 1864. I have sealed the west door and replaced the key within the child's shoe. When they come for the property, they must not unmake what I have bound. The fault is in the blood. The fault sings. After that line, there are no further notes until the early 1870s, when the handwriting changes again, this time to that of Eleanor Harlow, widow of Abel's eldest son. Her tone is more lucid, though no less haunted. I have at last seen what they feared. The bones are arranged with too much order to be accidental. Every curvature is mirrored, as if the spine remembered itself. The breath that moves the walls comes and goes like a tide, slow and regular. When I press my ear to the stone, I feel it listening. They called it inheritance, but it is contagion. It passes not through love or proximity, but through attention. The more I look, the more it becomes me. Elinor's final entry, dated February 1872, reads almost like a surrender. If any soul finds this book, know that it is not knowledge you hold but invitation. The name we bore is not ours alone. It waits to be spoken again. Dr. Pennington's annotations in the margins of the ledger show growing unease. He cross-referenced the anatomical notes with existing medical texts and found them technically competent but philosophically abhorrent, noting that several descriptions of the vertebral fusion precisely match congenital conditions later identified as kyphoscoliosis. Yet the Harlow and Ames specimens he searched for in county burial records do not appear. No graves, no hospital admissions, no coroner's files. Pennington summarized his findings to the committee in measured, bureaucratic prose. It is impossible to determine whether the Harlow and Ames entries refer to real persons or merely hypothetical constructs. However, given the absence of official records, it seems likely that these were internal family documents, never intended for publication. The mention of breath, voice, and response may represent psychogenic manifestations of guilt, rather than physical phenomena. The still, his private notebook, found posthumously among his effects, contains an unsubmitted addendum. The book hums when opened. Faint, but steady. The sound is localized, audible only to the holder. Prolonged exposure produces nausea and unease. I returned it to the trunk and sealed it again. It should not be read. After Pennington's death in 1907, the ledger vanished once more. County inventories list the trunk as disposed of due to mold contamination, but no record of destruction exists. In local rumor, the book was sold privately to a collector of Civil War ephemera, who kept it in a glass case until his house burned in 1918. No remnant was recovered, yet the name's succession reappeared unexpectedly in 1931, in the papers of a folklorist from Emory College, Dr. Isabel Crane, who had interviewed elderly residents around the former Harlow estate. Her notes record several consistent accounts. The breathing cellar, the iron air, and the book that answers if you call it by name. She dismissed them as superstition until a local child, no relation to the family, was reportedly found sleepwalking near the ruins, murmuring a single phrase in a voice not his own, "The fault sings." A Crane's commentary, though skeptical, closes with a line that echoes Eleanor's last entries. There is a quality of inheritance not confined to blood. Stories, too, reproduce. They adapt, they wait, and when the mind is most unguarded, they continue the experiment. By the spring of 1935, The Harlow property had long been parceled into suburban lots, its main structure demolished, and the cellars filled with concrete. Only the outbuildings remained, a stone carriage house converted into a toolshed, and, farther west, a low brick annex whose original purpose no one quite remembered. It was there that Dr. Isabel Crane, continuing her independent folkloric study of the Harlow resonance, obtained permission to excavate. Her surviving notes, preserved among the Emory archives, are remarkable for their restraint. Crane was a disciplined academic, reluctant to endorse superstition, yet each line of her field diary seems to fray at the edge of reason. May 9, 1935, the ground yields easily here, as though previously disturbed, found fragments of animal bone, dust, goat or pig, uncertain. Smell of old metal. Beneath the lowest layer, a section of stone floor. Carved letters too eroded to read. The workmen refused to touch it after dark. May 11th, lowered the phonograph cylinder into the excavation overnight to capture vibrations. The playback reveals a low oscillation at 34 Hz. The pattern repeats every 21 seconds, steady as breath. Unaccountable, given the absence of machinery nearby. May 12th, dreamed I was beneath the house. Heard a voice repeating, succession, in a tone not angry, only patient. Woke with soil beneath my fingernails. Crane referred to her project as the residual procedure, borrowing the phrase from a marginal note in Pennington's private notebooks. The term appears nowhere else in medical or anthropological literature, suggesting she coined it herself to describe whatever she believed was occurring, a phenomenon left behind by the living, imprinted on the environment, and capable of resuming its pattern when disturbed. Her assistant, Charles Merrin, wrote a separate account published posthumously in Southern Anthropological Review, 1948. His recollections confirm the existence of several sealed jars recovered from the dig, glass vessels of 19th century make, each containing an unknown fluid and fragments of organic matter. One bore a fragmentary label still legible. Spec. 2A, Harlow line. The Crane instructed Merrin to pack the jars in ice and transport them to her laboratory at Emory. There she began a series of non-invasive tests, noting that the fluid remained clear despite age and exposure. But in her notebook she recorded something stranger. Upon warming, a faint movement in the sediment, like the twitch of a muscle remembering motion. Microscopy inconclusive. Pattern resembles not tissue but mineral lattice, possibly ossified marrow, yet there is regularity, as though design imposed at cellular level. Her entries grow increasingly erratic through June. She ceased submitting progress reports to the university and continued privately funding her own materials. Letters to colleagues hint at a mounting obsession. June 8. The substance appears to respond to human proximity. When the hand remains above the jar, minute ripples form in the liquid surface. Possible thermodynamic explanation, though the reaction is delayed and rhythmic. Pulses every 9 seconds. June 12. Attempted to photograph the reaction under red light. Film overexposed at center despite low intensity. When developed, faint vertebral shape visible across all frames. June 13. I no longer require playback of the phonograph to hear it. The sound persists in the bones of the skull, subsonic but deliberate. It does not cease when I leave the laboratory. On June 16, Merrin returned to the lab to find Crane unconscious beside the workbench. She revived briefly, muttering the phrase, "The inheritance is awake," before falling silent. Hospital records from Grady Memorial describe her condition as catatonic with intermittent tremor. She was placed under observation for 6 days, during which time the jars were sealed and transferred to the university's medical department for storage. Dean of Medicine Dr. Edward Mallory, upon reviewing Crane's notes, issued an internal memorandum. Professor Crane's condition appears to stem from exhaustion and possible chemical inhalation. Nevertheless, her samples present unusual preservation characteristics worthy of study. I have instructed Dr. Merrin to continue examination under proper supervision. The next month, Merrin performed what he later called a controlled reactivation. His typed report, dated July 22, 1935, is the last known document associated with the jars. Sample 2A exposed briefly to direct heat source. After approximately 4 minutes, the liquid began to effervesce, producing a faint luminescence. Oscillations recorded by tuning fork approx. 3235 itras. Audible component described by assistants as whispering, though analysis reveals only infrasound. 86 min. 10 sec. Exposure. Jar vibrated violently and fractured along pre-existing fault. Contents emitted odor of rust and ozone. One assistant vomited. Another reported brief loss of equilibrium. No chemical residue identifiable post-event. The material appears to have evaporated entirely. After this incident, the medical department sealed the remaining jars and suspended all research. Merrin resigned that autumn, later claiming in a private letter that he still heard the oscillation whenever he closed his eyes. "It is the rhythm of something learning to breathe again," he wrote. "A pattern, not a ghost." A crane herself never recovered. Confined first to a sanitarium in Milledgeville, and later transferred to a private institution in North Carolina. She wrote no further papers. Visitors described her as calm but distracted, often humming in long intervals and tracing loops on her bedsheets. When asked what she was drawing, she would answer, "The curve of inheritance." Upon her death in 1943, her personal effects were inventoried. Among them was a single slip of paper bearing one line in her handwriting. "The fault is older than the family. The family is merely where it learned its name." In the decades that followed, the Harlow case slipped again into obscurity. The land where the annex once stood became part of a public park. Locals complained of a persistent hum heard near dusk, dismissed by the city as resonance from underground cables. Yet the frequency measurements taken in 1971 by an acoustics team, unaware of the site's history, recorded an anomaly centered at 34.2 etched, identical to the vibration logged by Crane 40 years earlier. Their conclusion was banal, possible result of subsurface airflow through disused foundations. Still, one technician later wrote privately that the sound had a human cadence, as if drawn through a diaphragm. "I felt it in my chest rather than my ears," he noted. When we shut off the instruments, the rhythm continued for 3 full seconds before fading, like a breath released. The few surviving scholars of Southern folklore, who revisited the Harlow material after 1970, agreed on one point: whatever the ledger described, whatever Crane called residual procedure, was not simply a haunting. It was a continuation. A process that once begun required witnesses to maintain it. Professor Anna Lucier, in her 1983 monograph Anatomy of Inheritance, summarized it this way: each generation encounters the Harlow record not as history, but as task. The more they attempt to observe, the more the experiment proceeds. Their documentation is its respiration. Her argument was dismissed at the time as poetic nonsense. Yet when a flood in 1985 damaged the Emory archives, only one box remained perfectly dry: box 44, Harlow Crane Succession. Inside, the paper edges were warm to the touch. In retrospect, the events of 1935 appear not as an ending but as a midpoint, the last documented instance of physical manifestation, before the phenomenon withdrew into rumor. The procedural language of Fenn, Vey, and Crane merges across the century into a single voice repeating the same principle: record, observe, inherit. Each believed they were preserving evidence. In truth, they were feeding it. The jars are gone, the ledger lost, the house erased. Yet the hum persists whenever their words are read aloud. Whether natural frequency, neurological echo, or something older than human anatomy, the result is the same. The pattern resumes. If you listen closely, even now, at the edge of memory, or beneath the hum of the nearest machine, you might detect it. The measured pulse of the residual procedure, continuing its slow experiment, through whoever dares to remember. And someone always does. Recovered fragments compiled from estate documents 1902-1911, collated by Dr. Ellis Marrow, Department of Antiquarian Studies, Emory College, 1924. 1. The trunk from Devonshire Hall in April of 1902. During renovations at Devonshire Hall in Atlanta, formerly the residence of the Vey family, a carpenter pried loose a section of warped floorboard beneath the old study and uncovered a trunk bound in iron and wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside were papers, letters, and fragments of what appeared to be machine schematics, brittle and water-stained. Some bore the seal of the Harlow facility, others were addressed to Dr. I. Vey, Gantry Cotton Works. The discovery drew modest local attention until a librarian named Elias Kroom, himself a descendant of one of the original facility overseers, offered to translate and catalogue the material for the Historical Society. His preliminary inventory was never completed. In the autumn of that same year, Kroom was found dead in his boarding room, apparently of a sudden seizure. The trunk had vanished. When the estate's lawyers finally unsealed the room, they found only one intact item: a typeset broadside nailed to the underside of the desk, its ink faint but legible. "We inherit not the deeds of our ancestors, but the debts unpaid. The machine is not gone. It waits where the land remembers." 2. Extracts from the Vey correspondence. 1873 to 1888 letter fragments show that following the collapse of the original Harlow enterprise, members of the Vey and Gantry families maintained a private exchange concerning continuing procedures. Their language is elliptical, half scientific, half religious. March 1873. Dr. Isidore Vey to Cyrus Gantry Jr. The principle of sympathetic compression remains untested. If the moral weight of an act can be quantified, it must find equivalence in matter. The press was never merely mechanical, it was spiritual calculus, iron translating sin into form. June 1874. Reply, Gantry to Vey. The land itself resists. Every attempt to reconstruct the apparatus fails, the gears warp, the ratios refuse their balance. Perhaps the debt you describe has already been paid in full, perhaps it is we who remain in arrears. After 1878, the tone darkens. Vey writes of auditory phenomena, near the site, of hearing voices that echoed beneath the soil like trapped steam. Gantry urges him to abandon the research, to let the ground seal its history. The last letter in the sequence, dated 1888, is unsigned, its closing lines smeared by ink and moisture. The boy is not gone, he is only waiting for someone to remember the price. 3. The Atlas fragment, among the trunk's contents, was a partial map of the Hapville district, 1851, marked with 8 small circles drawn in copper ink. Each circle corresponded to a later site of industrial accident, collapsed mills, boiler explosions, machinery failures that had occurred decades after the Civil War. A penciled annotation beneath the 8th read, "Repetitions of force seeking closure." Dr. Marrow, in his 1912, proposed that the map represented a geographical inheritance, an idea that the moral energy of the Harlow incident had imprinted itself upon the landscape, reproducing itself through generations of machinery and labor. He wrote, "Perhaps there was never one machine, but 8 echoes of the same principle, distributed like the copper pennies, tokens of equivalence between guilt and motion." 4. The Journal of Margaret Vey, unpublished, c. 1899. The nightmares began the week we reopened the Cotton Exchange office. I hear a slow turning sound, as though someone cranks an invisible wheel. It is always 17 rotations, no more, no less. The doctor calls it hereditary neuralgia, I call it the debt. My grandfather said the family owed something to the soil itself, that we were living on the interest of an unpaid act. Last night I dreamed of a small figure standing beside a river, pressing coins into the mud. When I woke, I found dirt beneath my fingernails. Margaret died in 1901. No autopsy was performed. Her death certificate reads simply, exhaustion of heart. 5. The account of Reverend Paul Etheridge, 1904. Reverend Etheridge, newly assigned to the St. Helena parish near the old Harlow grounds, recorded an encounter with an elderly woman identified only as Patient E, nearly blind, who claimed to have buried the boy that was never meant to die. She insisted the field behind the chapel. Whispers when the presses turn in town, and begged the reverend to place 8 pennies in the offering plate each Sunday, to keep the circle closed. Etheridge dismissed the tale as superstition until a summer thunderstorm washed out part of the parish cemetery, revealing an unmarked grave lined with decayed wood fragments and, according to his account, 7 dull copper coins arranged like the petals of a flower. The 8th was never found. 6. The missing years 1905-1906. During this period, a spate of fires broke out across industrial Atlanta. 3 textile warehouses, a metalworks foundry, and a machine shop, all located within a 12-mile radius of the former Harlow property. Each incident was ruled accidental, though witnesses described a humming under the ground before the first ignition, like a press tightening. Insurance claims from the gantry hares reveal an odd clause in their policies. Reimbursement was void if loss occurred within proximity to the Redemption Creek watershed. No record explains the origin of that restriction. 7. The Marrow hypothesis. 1924. In his closing essay on the Harlow papers, Dr. Ellis Marrow attempted to reconcile the scattered documents, proposing what he called the inheritance manifest theory. What we mistake for haunting may be the persistence of moral geometry. Every act of cruelty performed under the machinery of commerce inscribes its pattern into the materials that sustain it. The Harlow Facilities Press, built for compression of cotton, became an instrument for compressing history itself. The 8 pennies symbolize recursive equivalence. Value reduced to matter, then matter seeking redress through repetition. Each subsequent industrial failure near Hapville is not coincidence but echo, the unpaid balance manifesting in steel, timber, and flame. Marrow's colleagues dismissed the theory as metaphysical indulgence. Within a year, Marrow resigned from Emory and disappeared while traveling through rural Georgia. His car was found abandoned beside an overgrown path leading toward the old creek bed. 8. Oral account Ruthacrum, 1931, recorded by Works Progress Administration interviewers. My granddaddy said the land, remember what it's seen. Said the presses kept turning long after the men gone. At night you could hear 'em in the ground slow, like somebody working off a debt. Folks said don't walk near the creek with coins in your pocket, else the boy might take one, make you part of his circle. But I went anyway. When I was young, the mud there shine like metal. Sometimes I think the ground's still breathing. 9. Archivist closing note. Of the 8 copper pennies originally found in the 1889 cabin, none remain accounted for. Rumors persist that one resurfaced at a university auction in the 1980s, mounted in a glass case labeled only, Specimen, Georgia, 19th C. The coin was said to emit a faint discoloration, a greenish patina shaped like a child's handprint. The current location of the specimen is unknown. The Harlow site itself lies beneath a modern parking complex. No markers, no memorial. But during heavy rains, water pools in a shallow depression near the western edge, forming a perfect circle approximately 8 feet across. Locals say the puddle never dries entirely, even in drought. When wind passes over it, it ripples as though stirred by something turning beneath. Postscript undated note, handwritten in red ink, the machine is not buried. It is inherited. We are all turning the wheel now. The line decays but does not end. Flesh remembers what parchment forgets. From the private notes of Dr. Edith Lyle, 1979, the records of the Harlow case, sealed by the county in 1892 after the collapse of the sanatorium, were never meant to resurface. Yet in 1978, during the cataloging of disused medical archives at the University of Virginia, a graduate assistant named Edith Lyle discovered a mislabeled trunk in the sub-basement of Alderman Library. It had been filed under Azar D. Anatomitel Materai else, though its contents were mostly paper. The brass plate on the lid read only Harlow Institute, D. 1834-1871, property of the board. The lid resisted opening, its hinges swollen by age and rust. Inside were bundled folios wrapped in oilcloth, a child's caliper set, and a glass jar sealed with pitch. The jar contained a cloudy preservative fluid and something pale suspended within, a small vertebra, perhaps human. Lyle, believing she'd found routine teaching remnants from the antebellum medical department, requested clearance to study the contents for her dissertation on rural eugenic theory in the Reconstruction South. Permission was granted. That decision would ruin her career, and according to later testimony, her sanity. Lyle's first report, dated November 3, 1978, was composed in a tone of dispassionate precision. She described the manuscripts as mostly administrative records, patient examinations, and ledger sheets from a private medical concern, the Harlow Institute, located near Staunton, Virginia. The handwriting was steady, copperplate, frequently annotated in the margins by a second, later hand. She noted one recurring symbol, a circle divided by a vertical line, appearing on patient files and correspondence alike. In one ledger entry beside the symbol, the annotation read simply "Carriers confirmed." The documents covered the years 1834 to 1871, corresponding exactly to the period of Dr. Silas Harlow's operation as described in contemporary legal proceedings. Yet several details contradicted the official history. The ledgers contained names not present in any census record. Abigail Fenn, Merritt Pike, the Red Widow, and under condition entries listed archaic notations: osteo resonance, unspooled marrow, audible tissue. Lyle was fascinated. She began transcribing the ledgers, organizing them into a chronological digest. Within weeks, her notes shifted from analytical to personal. Her supervisor, Dr. Kenneth Alvey, would later testify that Edith appeared drawn into the material in a way that exceeded ordinary academic enthusiasm. She spoke as if the institute were still operational. Her field diary, found later in her apartment, corroborates that claim. Excerpt from Field Diary, Jan. 4, 1970. The handwriting in the later entries, the marginal notes, is too modern to belong to Harlow himself. Late 19th century, perhaps, but some of the ink fluoresces faintly under UV light. I've never seen that in iron gall formulas. Under the fluorescence, the words shift. Letters become others. Today I read the same line twice and it rendered two different sentences. The first, the marrow whispers when warmed. The second, the dead converse when summoned. By February 1979, Lyle had traced several Harlow patients' descendants still living in Western Virginia. She wrote them letters requesting interviews, explaining she was compiling a genealogical medical study. Of the 8 she contacted, only 3 responded, and each asked to meet in person rather than speak by telephone. The first was Elias Crane, age 62, of Rockbridge County. His grandfather, Benjamin Crane, had been a caretaker at the Harlow Institute before the fire. According to Lyle's later audio notes, Elias refused to step inside her rented cabin and conducted the interview on the porch despite the February cold. He brought with him a narrow box bound with twine. "My grandfather said they kept something alive down there," Elias told her. "Said it weren't a person, not by the time they were done. They said it could hear blood move through the walls." He untied the box and showed her its contents: 6 copper pennies arranged in a circle, each drilled through the center and strung on wire. "He wore these around his neck when he quit that place," Elias said. "Said they were payment returned. He told us, if ever the papers resurface, scatter the circle. I never did. I suppose now it's too late." On February 16, Edith sent her supervisor a letter, never mailed but found among her effects. It read in part, "The structure of Harlow's experiments parallels Mendel's, yet predates them by decades. He catalogued physical traits, short limbs, curvature, congenital deafness, not as diseases but as lineages. The word inheritance appears hundreds of times, often capitalized. But he doesn't mean property or genetics. He means contagion of form, the persistence of design. He believed flesh remembers its original intention. He wanted to summon that memory back to the surface." That same week, the night custodian at Alderman Library reported seeing lights in the basement long after closing hours. The next morning, the trunk's contents had been rearranged, the jar unsealed, its fluid partially evaporated. In the residue at the bottom, janitors found something that looked like hair. Interview transcript, a university security, Mar. 2 1979 Alvili, did you notice anything unusual before she went missing? Sustaduen, just the humming, thought it was a machine, some kind of lab equipment. Alvwi, and the humming came from where? Custodien, from the papers, sir, from the papers themselves, like when you rub your finger around a glass rim. Low and steady, Edith Lyle disappeared on March 1, 1979. Her car was found 2 days later, abandoned along a service road near Staunton, the same region where the original institute had stood. Inside were notebooks, the 6 drilled pennies, and a tape recorder containing 47 minutes of audio. The recording begins with Lyle dictating her notes, then devolves into panicked whispers. Near the end, there is a faint rhythmic sound, wet and mechanical, like a heart or a pump operating underwater. Then silence. State police conducted a search of the area, but found nothing except the stone foundation of an unknown structure. The soil nearby was disturbed, as if recently dug and refilled. No human remains were identified. The case was closed as a probable suicide. But the documents did not vanish again. They were quietly transferred to a restricted collection at the university's Special Research Division, where they were studied under controlled access. Every researcher who handled the Harlow papers afterward reported the same symptom within weeks. A persistent auditory hallucination described as internal resonance. A sound like blood rushing against bone. Several requested reassignment. One was hospitalized after attempting to cauterize his own ears. In 1983, the collection was sealed by administrative order, yet digital catalogs list it today under a new identifier box H47, Genetic Correspondence 1834-1871. Its summary notes, access restricted pending further ethical review. No such review has ever been scheduled. Addendums email chain Feb. 14 2006 recovered from UVA server. From Dr. Marcus Trammell, Toll University Archives staff. Subject read box H47. Request for temporary transfer. I understand the hesitancy, but the Lyle material may contain data relevant to my study of epigenetic imprinting in rural isolates. If possible, I'd like the jar specimen and the 6 coins sent to my lab for imaging. I'll observe all safety protocols. The resonance phenomenon reported in the 1980s could prove instructive regarding neural feedback loops. Replies archivist. The jar is missing. Last signed out by E. Lyle in 1979. No record of return. By spring 2006, Trammell's lab had begun receiving anomalous readings during magnetic imaging trials. His notes later confiscated. Detail: oscillations in the fluid medium at subsonic frequencies corresponding to human pulse rhythms. He theorized that the vibration originated not from the jar, which was indeed missing, but from the documents themselves. The iron gall ink, whose metallic residue might act as a conductor. On May 7, during a demonstration for graduate students, one of the folio sheets reportedly moved. Witnesses described a slight contraction, as if the parchment had flexed along its fold. Within seconds, all fluorescent bulbs in the room burst simultaneously. Emergency power engaged. The sound of humming was recorded on video for 12 seconds before the footage cut out. Trammell vanished 2 days later. His office door was found locked from the inside, the windows sealed. On the desk lay an open notebook, and written across 12 pages in a jagged, unfamiliar hand were the words, "Inheritance continues. The Marrow hums." By the following semester, box H47 was again sealed, this time under federal directive. The official explanation cited contamination by unknown bioactive residue. Unofficially, campus maintenance crews reported that the floor tiles near the archive room sweated on humid nights and emitted a faint copper odor. Today, only fragments of Lyle's transcriptions survive in digital form. Among them, one final annotation written in what appears to be her own blood. He did not mean heredity. He meant return. Each generation is the echo of a wound trying to close. If you've followed the Harlow story this far, you may think it ended with the collapse of the Institute, or the fire that erased its records. But in every decade since, the pattern repeats. Someone finds the papers, hears the resonance, follows it to its source. Maybe you're reading this now under fluorescent light, and it flickers once for no reason. Maybe you feel a faint vibration in your jaw, a pulse in your bones you can't quite locate. That's how it begins. Because the Harlow inheritance is not a story about bloodlines or names. It's about echoes. The way cruelty reverberates through time until the flesh itself begins to answer. History ends where flesh remembers. Anonymous marginal note, Box H47. By the winter of 2007, the Harlow papers had been sealed for the third and final time. Officially, the University of Virginia transferred them to the custody of the National Archives, citing biohazard risk. Unofficially, the archivists simply wanted them gone, but the transfer never happened. Somewhere between Charlottesville and Washington, the crates vanished. The courier manifest lists, 3 boxes, contents, historical documents, non-perishable, loaded into a government van. At a way station outside Culpeper, the driver signed his own departure log, walked into the woods, and was never seen again. The van remained, doors open, engine idling, the boxes gone. The only object recovered was 1 copper penny pressed into the steering wheel's leather. The next public mention of the Harlow Institute appeared 6 years later in a niche anthropology journal. A paper titled, Epigenetic Transmission in Isolated Populations, Revisiting the Harlow Hypothesis, was attributed to Dr. E. Lyle, though no such person was employed by any university. Its abstract consisted of a single sentence. We have resumed the study. The article was removed within 24 hours. Its cached version contained 8 figures, diagrams of vertebrae, bone marrow sections, and something resembling sound waves mapped onto DNA helixes. At the center of each image, faintly embedded, was the same vertical line through a circle symbol that had marked Harlow's ledgers. The journal's editor claimed the file appeared overnight in their submission system without origin metadata. When he attempted to delete it, the system froze. The next morning his office lights hummed at a low frequency that maintenance staff could not identify. He resigned a week later. It would have ended there, buried once more beneath bureaucracy, if not for a local radio documentary that aired the following spring. The producer, Nathan Fry, had been researching lost archives of the Reconstruction era when he stumbled upon references to the missing Harlow crates. His program, The Inheritance Files, ran on March 15, 2014. It opened with the sound of rustling paper and a woman's voice reading, The Marrow hums. Listeners thought it was archival audio from the Lyle tapes, but Fry later admitted he'd recorded it himself as atmosphere. Still, what followed was less performance than invocation. Fry played field interviews with residents near Staunton who reported underground vibrations after storms, and a farmer who'd found a circle of drilled pennies nailed to the beams of his barn. He also read excerpts from a 1932 Works Progress Administration oral history mentioning the Harlow's Curse, a family line of short-limbed children said to hear the worms speak. Fry dismissed it as folklore. By the next morning, the station's transmitter had blown its circuit. The recording remains unavailable, only transcripts survive. Excerpt from transcript. The Inheritance Files, 24T, Fry, narrating. They said the papers came back in boxes that weren't the same size they'd been shipped in. When they opened them, the pages had multiplied, new folios, new handwriting, all dated beyond the 19th century, as though the experiment kept writing itself. Female voice, unidentified date. It never stopped, Mr. Fry. It just changed hosts. After the broadcast, Fry began receiving anonymous packages. One contained a vertebra identical to the specimen from the 1979 trunk. Another held a VHS tape labeled Inheritance Session 9. On playback, the tape showed a dimly lit room, A single figure seated before a table strewn with documents. The figure's face was indistinct, as if filmed through water. At minute 3t14, the image flickered, and for a single frame, a sentence appeared burned into the static. SHURTERCFINTOT record D. In 2015, Fry vanished. His apartment was found empty except for 8 pennies arranged on the kitchen counter. The following week, the station's website Auto published an unscheduled post containing coordinates in rural Virginia. Exactly where the Harlow Institute once stood, a group of amateur historians went searching, expecting ruins. They found a hollow in the hillside and, within it, a room cut from limestone. Its walls were lined with shelves of human vertebrae bound with copper wire, each engraved with the years 1834, 1871, 1979, 2006, 2014, and one space left blank. Recovered field note, Virginia Historical Review, 2016. The air inside the chamber was still. We recorded a consistent 12 Hz vibration across every device, audible as a low hum. One of our team, Dr. Caldwell, complained of chest pressure and nausea. She described it as bones tightening. The hum increased in amplitude when any of us spoke aloud. We left after 12 minutes. When reviewing the audio, we found additional voices layered under ours, repeating the same phrase, "Inheritance continues." In 2018, the National Archives quietly announced a temporary reclassification of materials relating to antebellum medical research. Behind closed doors, they renamed the file group Biological Inheritance. Ongoing. That same year, a private biotech startup in Boston registered a patent using chemical formulas identical to those in Harlow's ledgers. The company's name, Marrow Systems LLC, its founder listed as Edith L. Ph.D. No further information available. By 2020, scattered anomalies began surfacing worldwide. Unexplained subsonic resonances beneath archives and hospitals. Unlabeled boxes containing copper pennies appearing in freight systems. DNA samples corrupted by low-frequency vibrations, as though the helixes were trembling. Each incident was small, localized. Each report cited possible contamination from external frequencies. But those who've handled the Harlow documents say otherwise. They say the inheritance is not metaphor. That every record, every copy, carries the pattern like a seed, that once you read the words, really read them, the pattern begins to reproduce inside you as bone echo, as humming beneath the skull, not infection, not curse, memory, the body remembering what it once was. Personal accounts unverified, 2023. I found this story online while researching dark medical archives. My speakers buzzed while I listened, even at low volume. When I scrolled past the word inheritance, my phone vibrated without notification. I thought it was coincidence until last week, when I woke to find 8 pennies on my desk. I live alone. The Harlow inheritance does not end with bloodlines. It moves through language, through replication, through the act of reading. Each transcription, each retelling, is another body remembering. Perhaps that was Harlow's design all along, to prove that knowledge, once written, becomes a living thing. To show that ideas have marrow. So if you're hearing that faint hum now, don't panic. It's not your speakers. It's your pulse sensing to the archive. The story knows you're listening, and the resonance always seeks new bone. You've followed the line to its end, but endings are only the point where memory changes form. If your lights flicker tonight, do not answer the sound. It's only the record adjusting itself to include you.